evening, and welcome again to Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott. And of course, state budgets are always contentious things, but particularly now in these economic times. So tonight, we have an expert with us to talk about what's happening with the state budget here in Illinois. Our guest tonight is Ralph Martire from the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability. Ralph, thank you so much for being back with us.
Oh, Kevin, thanks for having me on the program.
Now, it's been a while, so what I'd like to do is spend a little time to begin with talking a little bit about the center and how it got started and what it does, just so our viewers have an idea of why you're doing what you're doing and what the effect is.
Well, we're about as odd of an odd duck as you can be. We're a bipartisan, nonprofit 501c3.
Is there such a thing as bipartisanship?
Exactly. There's not much in the political playing field anymore, but there is on our board. I mean, our board really doesn't get along very well with each other because we have prominent Democrats and Republicans, but that's a good thing. It forces our organization to do what it's intended to do, and that is be fact-based, be evidence-based. And what we are trying to do is take all that silly partisan sniping and rhetoric out of these big discussions and say, look, at the end of the day, whether you're a Democrat or Republican, there's only one right way to finance government and to deliver services, and you all ought to support that, and here's what the evidence says. Or there's only really 2 or 3 good ways to provide education to kids in inner cities. Here they are. Here's the evidence that proves it. Now go make it happen. It's that kind of thing. We take a very data, evidence-based approach, attach it to best practices, and make policy recommendations.
So how long ago did the center get started?
10 years ago. You know, we've been around for a decade, and we've had a little bit of an impact. We're a small organization, but we've passed a number of bills and a number of administrative reforms. Collectively, the dollar value is over $2 billion. I mean, things like everything from administrative reforms where we saved a couple $100 million a year to the state and how it purchased prescription drugs, to getting about a $250 million tax break to low and middle income families through a state earned income tax credit.
So the $2 billion figure is not necessarily $2 billion in revenue to the state of Illinois, but the effect to whomever the legislation addresses collectively adds up to $2 billion, right?
Right. And although I think we're pretty close to that for a raise in revenue for the state. I mean, we've done a number of things. Decoupling from the federal appeal of the estate tax. You know, the one sort of progressive tax we have in Illinois that only a very small percentage of very wealthy people pay is the estate tax. And we were going to lose that when the federal government lost it. So we decoupled from that. We kept that tax on board, generating $200–300 million a year anyway for the state. And it's the only tax that's paid predominantly by incredibly wealthy people rather than low and middle income families.
Now, given the success in demonizing that particular tax throughout the country, how did we manage to avoid that here in Illinois?
Well, you know, we didn't. So the public discussion on that was brutal, you know, and people were going around saying, you tax dead people, like that old movie,
Right.
You See Dead People. And yeah, you know, I do. But it was the right thing to do. I mean, this goes all the way back to our forefathers. And so what we tried to do is work behind the scenes with leadership in both the Democratic and Republican Party to demonstrate that all the sort of the public flack over this issue was wrong. Losing the family farm. You know, that's one of the things that gets trotted out against the estate tax every year, right?
It's a cliche, yes, of the political dialogue.
Not is it just a cliche. When the American Farm Bureau was testifying in Congress about, you know, we're going to lose these family farms, they said, could you give us one example? And they couldn't. There's never been one documented case.
In the state or nationwide?
Nationwide.
Never a family farm that was lost because of estate taxes?
Never once. So, you know, it's one of these overplayed issues. I mean, in Illinois, less than 2% of the people pay the estate tax. And although the rate is set pretty high, I even forget what it is, 40%, whatever it is.
But it's on estates that are very large.
It's on estates that are large, and there's so many exclusions from what gets counted, even in the large estates, not just the standard deduction, certain things that get built up over time, capital gains, never get taxed. So the effective rate drops down to something like 16, 17, 18% for the richest of the rich. I mean, literally 98% of the people in Illinois could forget that this tax is on the books. So the way we were able to get that one passed was we didn't really fight a public battle. We went behind the scenes, and in fact, we worked very closely with organizations that were opposed to it and said, look, here are the facts. Do you have some that counter these? And, well, no. I said, I know you can't support it. Could you go neutral?
Just be quiet about it.
Just be quiet, and they went neutral, and we were able to get it done.
That's remarkable. I mean, particularly in this political climate, and with that particularly, as I say, demonized particular tax, that's quite a remarkable accomplishment.
Yeah, well, it was a few years ago, and that was even
things weren't quite as heated.
Not quite as heated. That was even before Blagojevich. That was under the George Ryan administration. But I think what we're proudest of is that we've been able to work with both Democrats and Republicans, and we've been able to be very much focused on doing the right thing from a data standpoint and best practices standpoint, and that resonates. And unfortunately, there's still a lot of legislators in both parties who care about that. They just don't get the microphones. And certainly when the caucus positions are taken, they are taken to the extremes, right? So
well, in the public positions, certainly,
yes.
because, and particularly now in campaign season, we're going to hear the most extreme political positions possible.
Yes, we are.
Well, that's what makes news, sadly. So it is actually reassuring to hear that there is a cadre there in Springfield who really do want to know what the facts are. What are the real options, and what are the economic impacts of those options? So segueing then from there into more contemporary issues, the budget is, since the last time you were on, it's even more of a mess than it was before. We have a huge budget deficit, and there's an election coming up, and no one has yet come up with anything that seems to be able to plug the gap. So let's start with what are the real numbers? What are we looking at?
Well, okay, let's talk about that for a second, because I think there's a lot of misinformation out there on that. The state has a total overall budget of about $50 billion. But most of that isn't the general fund. Most of that, the General Assembly, the governor have no discretion over it. It's things like bond funds. We sell a bond to build a road or a bridge, or a special fund like the road fund that's funded from gas tax and it's funded from tollways and stuff, can only be used for those purposes. So the fund we care about, the fund that actually delivers the bread and butter of public services, is the general fund. That right now is about $24.9 billion. It was 26 to start the year.
That is the projected expenses for that fund, correct?
That's what they've appropriated to spend on public services. So when the General Assembly passes a budget, this would be the budget they pass. And they say we're going to put this much money into education, pre-K through 12, this much into higher ed, this much into health care, this much into human services. It's that budget. But before we could spend a nickel on current services, there are other demands on our general fund, and this is where our huge deficit comes in. We still owe this deadbeat state $6 billion plus past due bills left over from last year. So to be clear what that is, small businesses around the state, primarily human service providers, went out and actually delivered the service on contract with the state. Human services are things like caring for the elderly, folks with developmental disabilities, folks with mental health concerns. That's human services. They went out and did that.
So they've already delivered the service.
All it is, and we didn't pay them. The state just didn't pay them.
And there's $6 billion in accumulated bills.
$6 billion left over from last year. So that's one demand that we have to pay this year before we could pay the current stuff by law. Then, we've been borrowing money, and you really can't borrow your way out of a deficit situation, but we've been trying. So we have $4.6 billion in debt service we have to pay out of our general revenue sources before we could start spending on the budget.
It's essentially paying the credit card bill, $4.6 billion.
Paying the credit bill, that's that. And then the final thing is the pension payments. And for decades, we just didn't make our pension payment into the system. Instead, used that like a credit card. Said, okay, our choice is cut some services that we care about or fully fund like a good employer should our pension obligation. Well, that's a long-term problem. I won't put the full contribution in the pension. I'll just divert a little bit money into education, into healthcare. So they did that for 30 years, and they ran up this huge unfunded liability. And then, of course, the markets crashed with the Great Recession. But long story short, they now have very large pension payments to make
in order to try to make up that,
cover up for past sins. So there's a ramp.
Right.
And this year that's $3.5 billion. So you add those together, you got $6 billion in past due bills. You got $4.6 billion in debt service. You got $3.5 billion pension payment. That's $14 billion of demand on your general revenue fund that you have to pay before you can get to your budget for your services.
And that allocation, what's already been allocated, that $24.9 billion, that's not including this extra 14.
Nope. This is just stuff we got to pay
before you can get to that 24.
Before you get to that 24.
And so how much revenue do we have?
Well, and that would be the problem. So we had about $40 billion in revenue demands, and we had about $27 billion in revenue. That's a $13 billion hole. Those other things, the past due bills and the debt service and the pension, have to be paid by law before we could get. So really that full $13 billion hole is in the budget that we passed for public services. And I want to be very clear what that is. It's four things. Because, one of the most frequently repeated claims this campaign season is candidate A, B, or C says, hey, I'm going to solve our problems with across-the-board cuts.
I'm going to cut waste.
across the board. That's the big thing now, across the board. Well, here's what the board is. It's education. That's 35% of our budget. It is health care. That's another 30% of the budget. It's human services, caring for vulnerable populations is 21% of the budget, and it's public safety. It's about 5% of the budget. You add all that together, that's 9 out of $10. 9 out of $10 in our budget goes to those four things.
In fact, this year you said that's more like 95%?
More like 95% this year because it's a really, really tight budget. And yes, I know this is Illinois, so we should probably have a line item for waste, fraud, and abuse. But the truth of the matter is, when you dig through the budget, there's not a lot of that going on. It's immaterial in fiscal terms. I think very material in a voter's standpoint.
Right.
But
and wrong in any case, but it
it's
wouldn't
wrong in any
materially
case,
change the budget, right?
If we could eliminate it, and it's being used as a distraction. Those that really don't want to see the state get on sound fiscal footing are sort of carrying this out as a red herring. But we have to eliminate all waste, fraud, and abuse first, really? Name me the business that has eliminated all waste, fraud, and abuse. And I mean, you know, this pixie dust of perfection doesn't exist in the private sector.
A platonic ideal that no one ever really gets to.
And unfortunately, it's been a huge disservice for Illinois. It's distracted voters from focusing on the reality of our state's tax policy. And our state tax policy is so bad that we have these deficits. It's really not because of overspending or anything else. In fact, a little bit on that. I mean, a lot of folks think, well, cutting spending is a rational decision. And in the abstract, it is.
Particularly the across the board. I mean, why couldn't you take 25% out? I mean, it would be drastic, but couldn't you do that? Take 25% out of public safety, out of public education, out of health and human services?
The answer is kind of yes, kind of no. So let's dig into that budget. We got a $24.9 billion budget. $5.8 billion, so let's just call it 6, is coming from the federal government in revenue that we have to spend on the designated programs, primarily education and health care.
Well, that's a quarter right there.
Yeah. So you can't cut that. Well, you could, but you don't save anything off of your deficit.
Because you're giving back federal dollars.
Yeah.
You don't
So every dollar cut, you lose the program, you lose the revenue, you keep your deficit. And that would be probably a bad decision. So that takes $6 billion off the top that you could even get to. So now you're really looking at a much smaller budget, let's say $19, $18 billion budget. But to draw that federal money down, we have to maintain certain state tax investments in 2 key areas, public education and health care.
Because the federal dollars are dependent on those levels of
somewhat,
spending?
yes. If we don't maintain our effort at a certain level, we don't get the federal money. So really, we can't cut that either. That's about another $8 or $9 billion. So now you've gone from a budget that you thought maybe you had 24, 25 billion in which you can work to really 10 billion. 10% across the board cuts in a $10 billion budget. Last time I did math saved you $1 billion.
Right, and we have a $13 billion hole.
Then that would be the problem. And really, you could not spend anything on the remaining public service, so literally, no human services.
So you'd have to cut that entire remaining $10 billion, and even there you haven't plugged the gap.
And even there you haven't plugged the gap. And let's talk about that remaining $10 billion. A lot of it's 1.5, 1.6 billion is public safety. Really? No more state troopers? That's a good idea? No more correctional officers in prisons? Just let's let the inmates handle things? I mean,
some would say that happens in Springfield.
Well, yeah, that's a different kind of inmate. But the bottom line is, you know, that's irrational. And in fact, we're under court order in a number of facilities, frankly, correctional facilities, to increase our staffing because we are blowing the constitutional rights of folks by being understaffed. Okay, so that's probably not very cuttable. There's maybe something in there, but not a lot. Now we're going to talk about human services. I hate the name human services. Doesn't tell anybody what it really means. So I'm going to tell you and your viewers what it means. 54%, over half of all our expenditures at the state level on human services cover just 2 things: caring for people with mental health and developmental disability problems. Now, just because we're having fiscal issues doesn't mean their developmental disabilities go away. I'm sorry, but vulnerable populations are still vulnerable. That's over half of human services spending. You get up to 3/4 of human services spending when you add in the Department on Aging, caring for homebound seniors, that kind of thing. The final 25%, the final quarter of human services are things like abused and neglected children, domestic violence, child care for single working parents, substance abuse supports, AIDS prevention and treatment. So we would literally have to cut all of that out
100%.
to get to the levels that we need to balance the budget with cuts.
Now, there is a particularly draconian school of political thought that says that it's not the state's responsibility to provide those services to begin with. And in a drastic budget cutting situation like this, that argument would say that, well, the state can't afford it. It's a nice to have, and in flush times maybe we could, but the state can go on even without spending that money. Those folks will find ways to fend for themselves.
You know, that's completely irrational and it makes no sense. And let's just take a couple of examples that I think make it real clear. Someone with a mental health problem is not going to magically be healed because we don't have the money to provide him or her with the supports they need. And if they don't get the supports they need, frequently they do criminal things. And then they go into our criminal justice system. They've created a victim from whatever they've done, and now it's going to cost us, instead of maybe $7,000 to $12,000 a year to help them through their mental health problem, $35,000 a year to incarcerate them. And that doesn't count what we have to do to help the victim. Better yet, go to domestic violence. Domestic violence treatment, you take abusive guys, and they're mostly guys. I'm not being sexist. There are some women, but let's face it.
It's mostly guys.
It's mostly guys. All right. To keep these guys from being violent and beating up their girlfriends or wives, it costs around, on average, about $7,000 to $8,000 per person. They get the counseling they need. They don't beat people up.
And it works.
And it works. It's very effective stuff. Well, let's close those centers down. These guys aren't going to magically become less violent. They will come home, they will beat their wives, they will beat their girlfriends. They will probably beat, in some cases, these women so badly that they'll have to go to jail. Once again,
and
that
the woman
magic
is a victim
increase.
who may be hospitalized,
Care. And one more step. There's probably children. They've probably been hit or at least witnessed it. They need now social services and whatever. Oh, and he's in jail, so they've lost his income. So now they need income supports. So being fiscally bankrupt really can cause a state like Illinois to make morally bankrupt policy decisions. That is purely morally bankrupt.
Would there be other organizations that would take up the slack? Years ago, President Ronald Reagan was talking about having public and private charities pick up some of the slack.
A little bit, but you know what? A lot of them get their funding from the state. Here's the big secret on public services, and in particular human services. The state doesn't directly provide those. 75% of the human services delivered in Illinois are coming from Catholic Charities, Lutheran Social Services, Jewish Federation. I mean, you could tick down the list.
But they're funded by the state.
They're funded by the state. If the state cuts off their funding,
they can't
deliver the service. And these are, in many cases, those are the big providers, but there are a lot of small community-based providers, right? They'll go out of business. People will lose their jobs. I mean, when the state cuts spending, well, folks have to realize that is spending on primarily wages for workers like teachers, correctional officers, police officers, social workers, healthcare providers. That's what we're cutting. The state doesn't have a lot of heavy equipment. I mean, what it's cutting is wages.
Right.
And so that destroys our economy. I mean, I know you love talking about the economy. Look, these are middle-income workers to lower middle-income workers who have a high, as economists would say, marginal propensity to consume.
That is, that they're going to spend the dollars they earn.
Yeah,
Mostly
they certainly
all of them.
are.
Right.
But now they've lost their job.
So they have no dollars.
They
take
don't
those
spend
dollars out of the economy altogether.
Directly. And you get a negative multiplier. And in fact, a cut at the level of, let's say, our deficit, which is now down to about $9.5 billion. Let's call it 9. If we were to cut $9 billion in spending using multipliers designed by a gentleman you know, Mark Zandi, the chief economist at Moody's.com, and by the way, no liberal economist. He was the principal advisor to Senator John McCain in his presidential run. Okay, this is a moderately conservative Republican economist. He said, for every dollar you cut in state spending, you lose $1.36 of private sector economic activity. In Illinois, that would mean, in addition to the direct job loss for the teachers and the police officers, et cetera, you'd lose another 128,000 jobs in your private sector because of this ripple effect. People that stop buying car repairs and groceries and stuff. It would be brutally stupid public policy from an economic standpoint to pull this spending out of our economy because there is nothing there to replace it, and you're taking wages out. And the bottom line is, and I don't know why everyone forgets this, 70% of the economy is consumer spending.
Now,
period.
But where does that leave us? That leaves us with tax increases in order
Yes,
to make
yes,
up
it
this?
does. It really does, and we should have done this years ago. And you know, a lot of
But
people.
that's a $9 billion tax increase. If
Well,
you
no,
can
you
plug
really
that
only
gap.
need about 7.8. Actually, we're going to be releasing a study within a few days that shows exactly what the state needs to balance its books, enhance school funding, eliminate the unfunded pension line, do all that stuff. It's about $7.8 billion, and that's a big number. I
That
mean,
is a big number.
Back when I was a kid, you know, 7.8 billion, you know, in the Paleozoic era, that was a really big number.
A billion here, a billion there. Pretty soon you're talking about real money. Right?
But think about it in context, because context really matters, and we certainly aren't going to get that from politicians. You're living in a state that has a $633 billion annual economy. A $7.8 billion tax increase is less than 1.5% of our economic activity.
1.5%.
1.5%, less than that. It's not measurable as to whether or not it could have an impact on the economic activity in the state because it's too small. And yet, Illinois can't have an adult discussion about this. And better yet, overall, from a tax burden standpoint, we're one of the lowest taxing states in the nation. We rank 44th in total state and local tax burden as a percentage of income, as a percentage of our
state income, right?
Personal income, right.
Well, personal income measured throughout the state.
Throughout the state. So think about that. That's including every tax and fee charged by any unit of state or local government. 44th in tax burden. So we're very low tax. We're 43rd in spending in the nation. We have the 5th biggest population. We're not meeting need. We're a low spending state, and we have a deficit approaching 50% of our general fund budget that goes to the core four services of education, healthcare, human services, public safety.
So
that's not sustainable. But one more economic thing. Despite being so low tax, since 1990, our economic growth has lagged the much higher tax Midwest and the much higher tax rest of the nation. The higher tax states are kicking us in economic growth.
Is this part of the study that you're going to release?
Yes, it is.
And so we can look back and see the numbers. And that would, will that be publicly released on the center's website?
Yeah.
Okay. So coming back to specifics, if there is this 7.8, call it $8 billion tax increase, what gets raised? And can we be sure that the economic impact of that tax increase, which would be unevenly distributed, some industry or some area would bear the brunt of that tax, how can we be sure that that area of the economy that's taxed wouldn't be negatively affected? Businesses wouldn't leave the state.
Well, okay, where are they going to go? We are lower tax than all of our neighboring states. We're lower tax than most of the nation. They're going to go to an even higher tax state? I mean, it's the most overplayed argument in the world. We're low tax. We're very low tax. And our economy's falling apart. And, in fact, businesses are already going to higher tax states. They're going to these higher tax states because they have better schools. They have better infrastructure. They have a more reliable, stable system. A business doesn't really care at the end of the day about its tax burden as long as it can predict what it's going to be.
And as long as it can, if it can offset that in additional revenue, which in a healthy state they'd be more likely to do.
But, you know,
right?
businesses don't pay their taxes. We pay business taxes.
Yes, in taxes on goods.
I was a business lawyer for years. And I've got to tell you, a business is very good at figuring out what its fixed costs are, what its marginal variable costs are, and adding that into the price of the good or the service it produces. If it's not good at that, it ought not be in business.
Well, and many of them aren't in business if they can't figure that out.
Right. So taxes are just one more cost that gets passed on to purchasers. Let's just be honest here. I mean, so yeah, maybe they're the ones that write the check. We're the ones that pay the bill. So, you know, it's one of those most overplayed subjects that really doesn't bear any relationship to reality from whether or not it has a positive or negative impact on the economy. But I will say this. If we start doing a better job of investing in schools, if we start doing a better job of investing in infrastructure, we'll start maybe attracting some of those higher-end businesses back into the state instead of losing them. And I know globalization has caused part of the business loss on the high end, and I don't dispute that. In fact, the data are very clear on that, but our rate of loss of high-paying, good-benefit jobs is worse than the Midwest or the nation. So we're also losing to Iowa, which is much higher. If we had Iowa, if we took the same percentage of personal income in taxes as Iowa does at the state level, we'd have an additional $11 billion in our general fund.
That would plug the gap right there.
That would plug the gap right there. But Iowa's nice and stable. Iowa does a really good job of investing in their infrastructure. Iowa has great public schools.
So
there's a message here.
Is your recommendation then, though, to focus the tax on income tax and to raise personal income tax?
There's two ways we have to fix our tax system. The principles you're supposed to have are that your tax system is fair, responsive, stable, and efficient. We're 0 for 4. And due to some constitutional constraints, et cetera, we can't just fix them the easiest way. So we got to do some hoop jumping. I mean, number one, we do have to increase the state's personal income tax rate from its current level of 3% to 5%. Some might think, well, if you add 2 percentage points to 3, you get 5, because 3 plus 2 is 5. Very complex math, I know. It won't be called that. Because
it'll
to
be
the
called
change,
67%,
67%, right? To
right.
the change in the rate divided by 3.
Right, right.
But you know what? We have the lowest income tax rate in the country, dead lowest of any state with an income tax.
What's the nationwide average for state income tax?
Yeah, around 5.8.
So even if we raise it to 5, we're still below the national average for state income tax.
Not only that, I mean, we'd go to the 7th lowest.
Even at 5.
Even at 5, and the 2nd lowest income tax rate in the entire Midwest. We wouldn't become Taxachusetts. But the difference is, we in fact, you want to know who we'd be tied with? Mississippi. We would jump up to Mississippi in tax rate.
Is it politically possible in this climate to raise personal income taxes?
Not during an election season, but afterwards it is. I mean, look, this is what they have to do. If they want to balance their budget, I am tired of politicians that are for public education, that are for people with disabilities, that are for health care, that are for public safety until they get elected. If you're going to be for the public services, you darn well better be for a way to pay for them. That's responsible. Don't borrow and spend. That's irresponsible. Don't promise voters and taxpayers they can have public services, but they won't have to pay for them and will make their kids do it. That's irresponsible. I mean, it is about time we started electing people to these jobs that don't want it so bad they're unwilling to do it.
Well, it sounds like the old pay-as-you-go that used to be the Washington mantra for a few short years.
Except Washington doesn't have to balance their budget. We do.
Right.
So that's number one. We increase the income tax rate. We expand the sales tax base to include consumer services, haircuts, lawn care, bowling. All of our neighboring states already tax those things way more than we do. In fact, Iowa and Wisconsin already tax every consumer service we at CTBA think we ought to be taxing, and a couple more. I don't know about you, but I've not seen busloads of people from Iowa coming here to get their hair cut. Although, frankly, I've seen their haircuts, and I think they should start coming.
With that image in mind, we're already out of time. There's so much more we could say, and I'm hoping that people will listen to this and take what you're saying to heart. So we'll have to see what happens after the election, and we'll see whether or not the people that we elect this time, in fact, follow your advice, and see whether or not they're willing to come to grips with the realities, the fact-based realities, and we'll see what happens.
Yeah, facts are great things.
They are. All right, Ralph, well, I want to thank you so much for being on the show. Hope you'll come back again soon. Actually, I'd love to think that the budget would be good enough where we wouldn't have to ask you back, but I know that won't happen.
Well, then you can ask me back for best practices for how we should be investing it.
There we go.
A much better program.
Okay. Well, thanks again. It's been a pleasure talking with you once again. And thank you for joining us once again on Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott. Please join us every Saturday night at 8 on Comcast Channel 19. You can also find us on the web at publicperspective.tv. So until next time, thank you and good night.